Deep within the forbidden city of Beijing, behind crimson walls and golden rooftops, lay a hidden world where thousands of women lived in silence and splendor. To the outside world, it was paradise. But for the concubines of the Qing Dynasty, it was a beautiful prison, where beauty determined your value and silence ensured your survival. Welcome to the Imperial Harem, where love too was politicized and made into an instrument of power and shame. What you are going to discover is not romance or legend, but the uncomfortable truth about life in the bedchamber of the emperor, a history chronicled in imperial annals and transmitted by the few who survived to recall it. It is 1644. The Manchus have overthrown the dynasty and established the Qing, the beginning of nearly 300 years of absolute monarchy. With the Manchus came a system of dominance so pervasive that it insinuated itself into every corner of the empire, right down into the innermost chambers of the emperor. Inside the freshly built harems of the Forbidden City, power and pleasure were blended into ritualized form. Intimacy was no longer a question of need. It became ritual, dehumanizing, calculated, and ruthless. At its maximum, the Qing Imperial Harem comprised between 3,000 and 20,000 women. They came from across the empire, chosen for their appearance, intelligence, or political standing. They entered the palace as teenagers, some as young as 13, and would never again see their family. Once inside, they were ranked, 8 official grades from the empress down to the lowest servant maids. This wasn't just determining where they slept and what they ate. It was defining how valuable they were as human beings. The selection process was ruthless. Young girls were undressed and subjected to inspection by palace eunuchs. Their bodies were examined in minute detail, their teeth counted, their breath tested, their skin checked for flaws. Those who passed this degrading inspection were subsequently educated for months in palace etiquette, designed on how to walk, speak, and be in a way that erased any trace of their prior self. Once they were within the palace walls, their lives became a waiting game, waiting to be noticed, waiting to be summoned, waiting to be made meaningful in a world where they were voiceless and powerless. The emperor's private life was controlled by the imperial household department, controlled by eunuchs who recorded every detail of each evening's experience. These men, castrated by the system themselves, had extraordinary power over the women that they controlled. Each evening there was a ghastly ritual. A silver dish was presented to the emperor, and on it lay wooden tiles with the concubines' names written upon them. The emperor would choose a dish off the menu, then toss one tile, and she was his for the evening. No decision, no warning, no willingness. She was simply chosen, her destiny determined by the flipping of the hand. Once selected, the concubine would undergo a choreographed ritual with a high degree of accuracy. She was taken to a reserved room where eunuchs and female servants took away her whole wardrobe and personal belongings. Each hairpin, each trinket, each moment of identity lost. It served 2 purposes: to make the emperor secure from hidden weapons and to disrobe the woman of her most vulnerable form, a blank page for imperial exploitation. The most degrading moment came next. Naked concubine was tightly wrapped in a yellow silk blanket, rendering her totally immobile. Naked concubine was carried on the back of a eunuch along dark palace corridors like merchandise. Her procession through the Forbidden City was designed to inculcate submission. At each checkpoint she passed, there were more eunuchs who confirmed her identity and documented her passage. The very fabric was a witness to the hierarchy. There were more gates and guards the closer she got to the emperor's quarters. By the time she arrived, the concubine had been put at the foot of the bed, not beside the emperor, but at his feet. There, the next ritual began. She had to crawl. On hands and knees, head bent, she crept up to the emperor. Eye contact was taboo unless specifically allowed. She crept slowly and laboriously, giving the emperor time to see her. Some were instructed even to crawl until it took an incense stick to burn. Crawling too fast showed arrogance, crawling too slow reluctance. Both mistakes could get her punished. In the scene, the concubine was not allowed to be speechless at all. No sound, no words, no display of pain or pleasure. She had to be motionless and mute, like the silk that enveloped her, or the wooden board with her name inscribed on it. She was not allowed to touch the emperor, to kiss him, even to stir without permission. She was never allowed to be over him, not even figuratively. Each respiration, each movement choreographed. Eunuchs stood just out of sight, monitoring the time with water clocks, ready to intervene if it did not last long enough. And when it was over, when doors were closed and the ceremony complete, the price was sometimes even more terrible than the act itself. But that chapter was only just getting started. No sooner had the emperor finished, eunuchs would hurry back into the room. The concubine, again exposed and vulnerable, was questioned at once about the incident. But the question most crucial wasn't asked to her. It was asked to the emperor. Should the seed of the dragon be preserved? This chill question determined the woman's fate. If the emperor did not desire a pregnancy, there ensued a gruesome procedure detailed in palace documents. Forceful abdominal massages by the eunuchs would be directed at expelling the semen of the emperor. These were not gentle medical treatments. These were brutal attacks. The eunuchs would also hit the woman's abdomen with their fists, jump onto her body, or use wooden instruments, with the consequence that concubines were battered, bleeding, and traumatized. Worst of all, in this period of complete vulnerability, some of the eunuchs took advantage. Despite being castrated, they used these acts as a cover for sexual violence. The concubines, naked, defenseless, and unable to speak out, could not file a complaint without being put to death. The very men who were supposed to protect the emperor's interests became predators under the cover of darkness. Resisting such brutal rituals cost dearly. The palace maintained a strict system of punishment, which was close to sadistic. Minor offenses, saying something during sex or crawling incorrectly, might result in beatings, starvation, or imprisonment. But more serious crimes, like trying to interfere with forced abortion procedures or sneaking out to the emperor outside of appropriate procedures, carried much darker consequences. The worst dreaded destination for those criminals was the cold palace, a faraway, inaccessible corner of the forbidden city reserved for discarded concubines to be forgotten. These women weren't imprisoned in the technical sense, but they were ostracized. Without heat, nourishment, visitors, or exposure to the world beyond, they existed in silence. Some went mad with loneliness and died. Others took their own lives. The cold palace was a phantom graveyard for living women. Physical punishment for more egregious crimes was inflicted with gruesome thoroughness. Histories report punishments such as death by 1,000 cuts, in which flesh was gradually stripped away from the body over days. Others were strapped to the wooden donkey, a torturing device that integrated genital mutilation with public humiliation. In one case, women were strangled with silk scarves, a so-called merciful death that left the body undamaged for funeral rites. Under this harsh regime, pregnancy was one of the few ways a concubine might achieve safety or status. Producing an heir for the emperor, preferably a son, could send her soaring in status and protect her. This desperation created an underground economy in the harem, where concubines sold jewelry, favors, or even their bodies for the chance of becoming pregnant. There was widespread corruption. Eunuchs, originally intended to discourage unwanted pregnancies, became powerful intermediaries for a black fertility industry. Some accepted bribes to perform weaker belly rubs that allowed conception. Others falsified documents claiming that the emperor had given permission when he had not. Others even manipulated selection rituals so concubines would be summoned on their most fertile dates. What was supposed to be a rigid, structured system dissolved into secret pacts, betrayal, and manipulation, all driven by the desperate dreams of women with no other means of escape. Others, who lacked wealth or influence to bribe eunuchs, attempted other methods. A few poisoned themselves by taking fertility tonics and herbal medicines. Others tried to interpret the mood of the emperor, hoping to win him over so completely that he would donate conception due to transient love. Some even tried to seduce the emperor during menstruation, hoping the blood would be mistaken for first-time bleeding and thereby trigger protection. Menstruation itself then became a reason for terror and control. Concubines had to report menstruation to the Imperial Household Department. Being chosen while menstruating wasn't just humiliating, it could be fatal. The emperor's bed was sacred, and desecrating it with menstrual blood was a death penalty crime. To protect themselves, women developed subtle signals: gold rings on one or more fingers, red markings on their ears, or a specific flower in their hair that announced that they were menstruating, but the signs could be used against them. Rivals would steal or swap these signals in the hopes of destroying each other. Palace servants were sometimes bribed to provide false reports of menstruation, putting another woman's life at risk. This constant fear compelled some concubines to try controlling their cycles by starving themselves, rigorous exercise, or poisonous herbs, irreparably ruining their ability to reproduce. The emotional price was enormous. The fear extended far beyond the boudoir. Women lived in a constant state of fear, never knowing when they would be chosen, never able to refuse, never free from the discerning eyes. Most of them suffered from severe stress disorders. Balding, shaking, and gastrointestinal illnesses became the standard fare. But physicians at the palace, also eunuchs, generally attributed these complaints as female hysteria and prescribed sedatives that left the women even more susceptible. For the lower-ranking concubines, life was especially harsh. They shared dormitories with dozens of other women, not knowing if this night would be their turn to be stripped and carried off as baggage. The distant tinkle of keys along the corridor, the distant rustle of silk, or the noiseless advance of an approaching eunuch became enough to trigger alarm. Women had created sleep rituals, trying to render themselves unattractive in the hopes of being ignored, but nothing could guarantee safety. In the Qing Harem, every night stood to be called, and to most, that possibility was a nightmare in disguise. Behind the majestic walls of the Forbidden City, amidst the silence and loveliness, there lived thousands of women whose stories were never meant to see the light of day. They were the imperial concubines, selected for their beauty enticed by obligation and trapped in a merciless machinery of dominance beyond imagination. Behind the red walls, it was not romance that played out, but a machinery of power, terror, and survival. Once the emperor's midnight visit was finished, the eunuchs would come in immediately. The concubine, bare and vulnerable, wasn't even given time to catch her breath. She was questioned about the encounter, but the most critical choice was not hers to make, but the emperor's own. Should the dragon seed be preserved? This chilling phrase was not metaphorical. It determined if a potential pregnancy would be allowed or forcibly terminated. If the emperor did not want conception, the response was swift and brutal. Eunuchs would administer brutal expulsion massages, pounding on the woman's belly and back in futile efforts to prevent fertilization. These were not medical procedures. They were forms of violence, which often left the women bruised, bleeding, and traumatized. But the violence did not stop there. Others exploited their position of authority and took advantage of the defenselessness of the women for sexual abuse. Those same men who were made safe and sterile turned into prowlers in the dark, abusers in ritualistic robes. And when women rebelled against this pitiless system, punishment was swift and brutal. The palace maintained a huge code of discipline in which even the most insignificant transgressions, chatting during intercourse, crawling incorrectly, could result in beatings, isolation, or starvation. More serious offenses like attempting to preserve a pregnancy or seducing the emperor through improper means typically exiled them to the cold palace. No heat in winter, barely any provisions, no contact with the outside world. Women who were banished there slowly lost their minds or chose death rather than a living ghosthood. Their screams echoed through the forbidden city as a warning to others. Disobedience equals erasure. Those who dared to hide pregnancies or lie about fertility were subjected to tortures enumerated in graphic detail. Some were subjected to the death of 1,000 cuts. Others were stretched on torture racks like the wooden donkey, endured public humiliation and genital mutilation. If lucky, they were strangled with silk, a so-called merciful death. Under this disgusting system, having a child was a woman's only possibility of salvation. Being pregnant with the child of the emperor, especially a son, offered a slender chance of protection. Such despair bred an underground economy. Bribes, bargains, favors, everything had a price. Even eunuchs, tasked with upholding purity, became middlemen in an illegal market of fertility. They'd falsify documents, falsify signatures, even circumvent the sadistic expulsions for a fee. A building meant to represent impeccable order became a beehive of corruption, fueled by desperation and deceit. For the poor or connected women, the risk was greater. Some drank poisonous herbal infusions in efforts to increase fertility at the cost of their lives. Others learned the emperor's moods thoroughly in the hopes of securing his temporary approval. A few tried to seduce him, even during menstruation, hoped blood would be mistaken for virgin innocence. But menstruation itself was dangerous. A concubine selected during menstruation could be executed for defiling the emperor's holy bed. To avoid this, the women developed code signals, rings on particular fingers, red marks on earlobes, particular flowers in their hair. But these too could be perverted. Vying concubines exchanged or pilfered symbols to destroy their rivals. The pressure was relentless. Some of the concubines starved themselves, exercised themselves to a pathological extent, or took dangerous drugs to regulate their cycles. Others had chronic anxiety, sickness, and insomnia. Always on guard, prevented from saying no to the emperor, they never knew when they would be summoned. The clinking of keys, the sound of approaching footsteps, or rustling silk became the sound of terror. Down in the lower dorms, dozens of women jammed into cramped rooms, each of them thinking, "Will it be my night?" Some tried to render themselves unattractive in hopes of being skipped over. Others did the opposite, primping for hours, in hopes of having their one opportunity of getting out of the darkness. But victory itself held new dangers. A pregnant concubine was formidable and vulnerable. Her increasing status posed a threat to others. Poisonings were rampant, miscarriages masquerading as accidents, contaminated food, or strategically positioned needles in mattresses. To safeguard them, the palace insisted on strict isolation, special chambers, food tasters, round-the-clock monitoring. But what was intended as protection was constriction. The birth itself was a ceremonial masterwork. Every gesture, every word was rehearsed. If the child was a boy, she might be rewarded. If a girl, she was quickly forgotten. And in either case, no matter what the gender of the child, the mother was rarely allowed to raise them. Imperial children were assigned to nannies and tutors, separating mother from child at birth. Women watched their daughters and sons mature from a distance, known but never embraced. When concubines reached old age, usually still in their 20s, they were rendered obsolete. When their looks had faded, so too had their utility. They shuffled the palace like ghosts, teaching younger women how to endure or escaping to opium or prayer. Some, who lived to be old, carried the empire's darkest secrets. They saw it all, but they could not discuss it. They buried their memories in coded memoirs, sewn into gowns or secreted behind walls. Others took their experiences to the grave with them, their stories forgotten over time. When the Qing Dynasty finally fell in 1912, reporters invaded the Forbidden City and found women who had not set foot outside in generations. They whispered by necessity, jumped at noises, and had no families to go back to. The evidence gathered painted a terrible picture. It wasn't sexual exploitation. This was a wholesale system of dehumanization. The crawling, the silence, the forced abortions, none were coincidental. It was a machine that was designed to break the spirits of women and turn them into servile shadows. And it did so for nearly 300 years. Contemporary historians who studied the records found further atrocities. Eunuchs kept meticulous records: who was selected, when, for how long. Pregnancies were tracked like crops. Wounds from the abortion procedure were logged with clinical detachment. Internal bleeding, organ damage, sterility, and then the same woman would be stamped, fit for duty. Even worse, the trail of cash. Eunuchs were bribed. Merchants sold drugs. Architects built new concubine quarters. An entire industry was born from women's bodies being utilized. The Harem system wasn't a custom, more like a cash cow. Early psychological assessments of survivors revealed signs of complex PTSD, night terrors, food hoarding, affect flatness. Some couldn't sleep at night. Others never stopped hiding food. Their wounds weren't visible, but they never healed. The Qing harem system's legacy went beyond the palace walls. It legitimized control over women's bodies, sexuality, and agency, scarifying future generations. And now, finally, their voices are being heard. The Forbidden City may have been lost to time, but its shadows endure. These stories, once hidden behind stone walls and silken screens, are proof of what absolute power can accomplish when left untrammeled, and the power of women, even in the darkest corners of history. Throughout the Qing Dynasty, a deeply ingrained belief governed the lives of women across the empire, a belief that their worth lay in their physical beauty and fertility, that they must remain quiet, and that their consent was not required. These beliefs did not stay within palace gates. They percolated throughout all levels of society, governing the making of families, the arrangement of marriages, and the treatment of women. At the very top of this pyramid stood the emperor, and his approach to concubines became the pattern which men everywhere sought to emulate, on scaled-down, more domestic levels. The Imperial Harem was not just an institution. It was a pattern for patriarchal control. Foreign visitors during the late Qing, particularly the wives of foreign diplomats with whom they rarely got to see the Forbidden City, testified to their surprise. They found women who were less human than living dolls, perfectly conditioned in submission, stripped of identity, and molded to obey without question. While these accounts were often filled with Orientalist bias, they also gave an outsider's glimpse into a world where those on the inside were not permitted to speak. And when the Qing Dynasty finally fell, the terror didn't end. Most ex-concubines, unprepared for life outside the palace, found themselves penniless, shamed, or worse, pursued by revolutionary zeal. Some of them committed suicide, having no idea how to live in a different world where they were expected to make decisions after decades of never being able to choose anything. The concubines' so-called liberation proved unhappily to be another installment of misery. Social reformers and humanitarians tried to help these women regain their humanity in the decades following the collapse of the dynasty. They quickly discovered how deeply ingrained the psychological scars were, however. Ex-concubines would instinctively crawl to touch authority figures. They were silent unless talked to directly. Their bodies reacted physically with a flinching touch. Even in freedom, many were still under the strictures of palace rules. Some took years to recover, others never did. And yet today, millions of visitors pass through the Forbidden City, staring on its gilt splendor, listening to stories of emperors and empresses, and being stunned by imperial majesty. But beneath the gold lacquer and intricate ornamentation is a tale that's often silenced, the tragedy of thousands of women, many little more than sex captives. Their existence is far too often reduced to rumor or fantasy love. They were actually tales of institutionalized violence. Feminist historians continue to come back to this, holding up the Qing Harem as a stark reminder that institutions will always transform desire into domination and intimacy into violence. The discussion is awkward, but it needs to be had, because this was not senseless brutality. It was deliberate, recorded, institutionalized. The emperor's harem was no chaos. It was a machinery of oppression. Every detail, whom she was selected, when she was summoned, if she was fertile, was recorded in bureaucratized detail. The men who created and sustained this mechanism were no savages. They were learned, elegant, and powerful, in reminding us that even the most elegant civilizations can be capable of great brutality behind elegant walls. When we imagine the concubines, masked in silence, stripped of their names, their authority, and their dignity, we must imagine them not as distant artifacts, but as people. Their suffering was not a cultural aberration. It was a systematic shame. Their silence was not mysterious. It was coerced. And what makes their legacy so powerful is that several of them, against all odds, survived. To connect, to construct moments of defiance. In the blackness of gilded cages, they discovered splinters of liberty. That quiet defiance, no matter how small, is proof that any system, no matter how deliberate, cannot forever silence the human heart. Because this is not just a story of sexual exploitation. It's a story about power, how it warps, how it corrupts, how it reduces individuals to objects, and how it dehumanizes the abuser and the abused as well. The emperor, who demanded to be obeyed, was as much a prisoner of the system as the woman who had to crawl before him. Even the eunuchs who carried out the emperor's orders were neutered to ensure compliance, reminders that power affects all in its pursuit of control. Today, when visitors to museums view silk robes and jewel hairpins, they pay scant attention to the fact that such items once draped women who lived in fear. The robe of a concubine might have been taken from her hours before she was made to crawl across a chilly marble floor. A painting of a peaceful beauty might have commemorated a woman who had no voice, no option, no liberty. The Forbidden City no longer keeps women in thrall, but still echoes with the silence they were forced to keep. Listen, and you shall hear it. Not an unearthly stillness, but a shivering lack of choice. Not a ritual of beauty, but an act of total domination. Not history, but warning. The final Qing Dynasty concubine died in 1975. With her past the final living memory of that world, but the records remain. Carefully kept files documenting names, appointments, pregnancies, and punishment. Not curiosities, they're evidence. Of a system that abused hundreds of thousands of women for centuries, and of a society still grappling with the scars. As we conclude this chapter, we have to face the hardest questions. How many women suffered as poets wrote palace beauty? How many were silenced as emperors were admired? How many were broken while foreign eyes looked on greatness? We will never know their names. Their bones have been reduced to dust. Their wooden slate is lost. But they must be more known than they were destroyed. They must be seen, not as supporting actors in men's lives, but as real women with hopes and voices stolen from them. In remembering how they were forced to crawl, we honor their strength. In seeing their silence, we reclaim their stolen voice. And as we face their anguish, we take one step further toward ensuring that power, untrammeled and unopposed, can never again degrade humanity so utterly.